Hello, you gorgeous teacher. Welcome to Everything EFL. I'm Erin. If you are one of my lovely regular listeners, welcome back. Lovely to see you. If you are a new listener and this is your first time, welcome. I'm delighted to have you. Maybe you're an Olly Richards fan. Obviously, if you've seen the episode description, you'll know that he features very heavily in this episode. I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I think it's really enlightening. I think it's a really important one. I think that his views align a lot with mine, and hopefully yours too. And while I have your attention, if you haven't yet subscribed to Everything EFL, why not? Press that subscribe button, please. And also, in the show notes, you'll see a link to my newsletter. It's not too intrusive. It's only a couple of times a month. And in there, you'll receive some freebies, some tips, just sort of some general chit-chat, just sort of some meanderings from my mind. Could be anything. Could be literally anything. But it's a great way to keep in touch. And, you know, if you have something to say, if you have any feedback or comments or suggestions or anything that you would like me to do, hit that reply button and let me know. I'd absolutely love to engage with you. So anyway, without further ado, let's crack on. Hi, this is Erin, and welcome to Everything EFL, my little podcast about English language teaching and other teachy stuff too. Credit and honourable mentions will be given during the episode or in the show notes. Let's crack on. Okay, so today I'm talking to someone who is giving me serious career envy. When I was listing his accomplishments for this intro, I started to feel quite bad about myself. He has a podcast, he blogs, he's published books. He's a bit of a language learning ninja as well. Is it 8 languages you speak?
I say 8 because it's better than changing the number all the time. But I mean, I've learned like 10 languages. These days I speak only half of them. They go up and down over time, and then I get some back, and it's all a bit crazy. But
We'll say
yeah,
8.
Let's say 8.
Yeah. He also offers language courses, and from I Will Teach You a Language, it's Olly Richards. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure. Did I miss anything?
No, that was a wonderful intro. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I've been listening to quite a few of your pods, and I'm finding them quite interesting because usually I would listen to other pods about how teachers teach, but you go from the perspective of how learners learn. So it's a different perspective. It's very educational. And one idea you subscribe to kind of goes against the training of the communicative method, which all teachers are generally trained in. So I'd like to start by talking about that. You did an interview with Dr. Stephen Krashen, which must have been a bit of a fangirl moment for you.
It was, yeah. I was, yeah. That was fantastic. It was a few years ago now, but that was great, yeah.
So he says that when we understand what people say or when we understand what we read, then the ability to speak results from that. And schools are very much about speaking straight away, whether it's eliciting single vocab words like white, pink, blue, or hello, how are you? My name is. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a few rocks to place in the jar here. So the first of which is that I don't think, based on the research into second language acquisition, that we can say much at all with any confidence about how people learn. I think the best that we can do is to say, in general, in certain contexts, these studies have found this possibility, this suggestion about how people might learn best. That's really as close as we can get. We don't know how people learn, and so as a result, what tends to happen in the language teaching world, whether that's in language schools or in the state system, is that you choose your method based on how you can make the most out of the situation that you've got. Because it's silly to think that a class full of 30 10-year-olds are going to learn the same way as a independent adult learning a foreign language for the first time. Language learning is so situation specific, context specific, that I think most of the decisions that I see being made by teachers, by ministries of education, by textbooks, by methodology inventors, whatever it may be, it's so much about it's 80% context, 20% theory. My kind of way into this was, I really started off as a language learner. So when I was like about 19, 20, I started learning languages with a real passion, and I lived in a few different countries, picked up a bunch of languages, and I kind of developed my beliefs about how you go about learning languages. And then in my late 20s, I had a kind of foray into the English teaching world. I did a CELTA, Delta, I did a master's degree. I taught for a few years as well. And I remember going into that, assessing the way that we were being trained to teach through the lens of my experience learning languages. And the whole experience was one of like, hang on, that doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? Like, why would you do something like that? But I came to realize that that's really, it's not about, it can't be about optimal efficiency, optimal language learning beliefs. It has to be about the context. So I think the communicative approach, it may well be the most appropriate thing for a state school situation. But I do think if the question is how are languages best learned, then I subscribe to Krashen's view, which is, as you said, you learn things, you acquire language when you understand messages which are either read or heard, and that's how we acquire. That matches up with how I've always learned languages. So all of which is to say that it depends, which is the most wonderful answer to everything.
Okay, thanks. So now, obviously, sort of, you're really into stories, aren't you? Like learning English through stories. Now, obviously, stories are used in schools and language lessons. I would argue with younger students more. So, do you think teachers of all levels and ages should exploit this method more? Because we're very stuck on the notion of production and speaking is the best thing. The more you
Yeah.
speak, the more confident you become. But that doesn't allow for shyer students or older students learning blocks or effective filters when it comes to language learning.
Yeah, well, there's so much packed into what you just said, right? So the problem you just articulated is about differentiation in the classroom. So how do you, this is another way that you have to judge the method that you choose. Like, does your method, is it purely the most efficient method, or does it actually also cater equally for shyer students, for more outgoing students? And I think there's a strong case to be made that the communicative approach would be great for students who are very outgoing, sociable, extroverted, but really horrible for people that don't like having a spotlight shone on them in class. So my approach with stories comes from this basic belief that we learn through input and we learn through context. And this is the view that I'm taking here is one of, as an independent adult learner, how do you learn best? That's where I'm coming from, right?
Yeah.
So I think so if I were teaching an adult, so if an adult comes to me and says, Olly, what's the fastest way for me to learn Spanish? I'll tell them, look, you have to get as much input as possible because you're going to learn the Spanish language through lots and lots of input over time. I think it's a different question in how you apply that to a school setting for the reasons that we've already talked about. And stories are a way to, I mean, the point I think is not so much about stories, but more about extensive reading, because extensive reading is really the act here. This is the kind of pedagogical tool. And you can do extensive reading with nonfiction just as much as stories, but I happen to like stories because they capture the imagination. People like reading books, they're fun and all that. So I think what I would say is that in general, I think that language teachers should try to use more reading in class as much as is possible. And that's mostly because very little reading is done at the moment.
It's true.
And so, I think it has to be down to individual teachers to understand their learners, to know how to get the most out of the class. But I think, a language education that doesn't include a good bit of reading, you've got to wonder, what they're missing there.
Yeah. So if a teacher decided, okay, I'm going to do an extensive reading project, let's say, because obviously it would take some time. In your mind, how should teachers instruct students, or how should the teacher approach this for a better payoff?
Yeah, well, it really depends on the level of the students. Okay, so if you're doing the calculation is very different depending on if you're teaching beginners or intermediate or advanced learners. So is there any particular area that you'd prefer to focus on?
I always tend to go towards adults because that's who I teach, but I know that I think a lot of my listeners teach younger learners, maybe teens.
Yeah. So I mean, again, even with teens, when you've got kind of beginner teens, or then you've got a high level teens, so it's very, 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 very specific. But I mean, there's a few different approaches. I mean, one of the first decisions you've got to make is, for example, are you going to do reading in class time, or are you going to set the reading for homework? And I think if you've got higher level independent learners, ideally you should set that reading as homework, because then you're maximizing class time. You should try to get, you want to always try and have as much continuation of learning outside the classroom as possible, right? So and stories are one of the best ways to do this, because you can literally just assign a story and say, right guys, go away and read it, and then we'll talk about it in the next lesson. And the lesson time is best used, obviously not for reading, because there's no value added there. The only way that a lesson kind of adds value to the reading is by giving you some kind of structured time to read where you wouldn't otherwise do so. But ideally the reading would happen at home, and then in the class time you can do all the kind of reading activities that you would normally do with extensive reading. We could talk about those if you're interested. But often that's just not practical, because you might not be able to get people to read at home. I mean, it's easier with a group of adults, I guess, than it would be with kids. It's difficult to get people to read at home. You might have to give them other homework because you've got tests coming up and stuff like that, in which case you're restricted to doing reading during class time, and then you're really up against it because you've got the rest of the curriculum to teach as well. So the way that I like to suggest approaching this is to look for links between the syllabus that you're teaching and that language content within stories. So for example, if you have to teach the past tense, can you find a story that's written in the past tense? Because then you're using the story to consolidate the learning. I mean, assuming that you're also teaching grammar in a more structural way, then by using extensive reading, you're able to kind of give practice at that stuff in a natural way. And in class time, it's really just a question of making the best of what you've got. So you're probably going to be choosing shorter passages of reading, and then try to find the time to do the post reading activities and the discussions and those kind of things. But in this kind of scenario, you're already talking about compromise and making work whatever you can. It's a tricky situation. So the British Council did some very interesting research a while back, which listed reasons that teachers don't use extensive reading in the classroom. And so by far the most common response was really not knowing how to, and not understanding how it can work. So I think there is probably a training gap in a lot of situations. So to someone who has who's never used extensive reading, I think the main thing I'd suggest is really just trying it out, because it can be difficult to figure out how to make it work, and it can be difficult to understand how it can be an effective use of class time, especially when you've got tests to teach. But I would really encourage teachers listening to try it out, because what you stand to gain, there's so much potential upside, right? From encouraging students to read at home, to just giving them more exposure to language, to giving them examples of what language is actually like in the real world when it's not hidden within textbooks. So there's so much to be gained. The most important thing is to give it a try, because you can't have any of the benefits of it unless you actually give it a try. So it's not as scary as it sounds. It really isn't.
No, and you're also quite into the notion of reading repetitively, so not just reading it once, reading it again and again, so that students notice different grammar patterns, they notice new phrases and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I find it useful. Again, it depends on the context, right? So again, if you're a higher level learner, let's say that you're a B1, B2 level learner, then I think it's a little bit different. I think at that point, the challenge ahead of you as a learner at that point is just acquiring huge amounts of less frequent vocabulary. And so in that situation, you already have a fairly decent command of the language. And so then just reading extensively is your best bet. Just read as much as you can on topics that interest you, because otherwise you're just never going to encounter enough vocabulary with enough frequency to ever learn it. But for lower level students, reading can be difficult, and you've got to relearn reading skills. So, we don't transfer reading skills from our mother tongue into foreign languages. So in reading in our mother tongue, we will do things like predict what's in the text from the headline. We'll kind of scan through to just get a sense of what it is. But when we're reading in a foreign language, we will just start reading from the first word of the first sentence, and then word number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. It's like we never knew how to read. So we have to kind of relearn reading skills. And that's one of the biggest value adds I think teachers can give, is actually helping students get from seeing a piece of text and seeing this big wall of text, which is what it looks like, a huge wall of words, getting from there to, okay, how do we approach this step by step? And actually showing them, okay, well, can you scan this and find a bit of information? Can you look at the title or the illustration and guess what might be in there? Try to get students behaving, reading in a more native-like way, because that opens up the possibility of reading in a more natural way. And so within that context, often what will happen when people read is, because they're focusing on just one word at a time, they can fail to actually grasp the meaning of what's happening. And I've done this plenty of times as a foreign language learner. I'll kind of really work my way through a Japanese text or something, understanding every word. And then I kind of get to the end of it and think, well, what was that about again?
Mm.
So hence the need to read and reread. And so if you imagine on the first reading, you get nothing other than the general topic. Maybe on the second reading, you understand the message. And then the third reading, you pick up a few new vocabulary words. With each pass at the text, your comfort level and your confidence level grows, so you're able to get and extract more information from the text. So that's why rereading can be so useful.
Mm. And you also mentioned, or was it Krashen who mentioned compelling input, which is a vital part of it as well. So I think if teachers choose texts that they know the students are going to be into, and maybe even offering a choice of texts, so they can have 5 or 6 different texts, which one are you into? And then you give the choice to the student, and I think that will probably motivate them a little bit more as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is the idea of compelling input is Krashen's idea, not mine, and I can't take credit for that one. But I absolutely I buy it 100%. Because just generally with language learning, the more interested you are in the topic area and the subject matter, the more motivated you will be to read, and the more motivated you are to read and understand, the more you'll pay attention and the more you'll end up reading. And so the kind of net gain is just is huge. And so the idea of offering students the choice of what to read, I mean, Krashen calls this free voluntary reading, FVR. In an ideal world, you'd have, in a school scenario, you'd have sessions blocked out during the week where the kids would just go in, pick something they wanted to read and just read it for pleasure, with no guidance, no instruction, nothing. So you're just fostering the reading habit. Again, teachers listening will understand the huge practical difficulty of implementing that. But I think it's good to have these conversations on what the ideal is, so that at least we can try to move in that direction.
Yeah. And I think
this is why I write books of stories. But sorry to interrupt. This is why I write books of stories, because when I've learned other languages before, I've found it very difficult to find interesting material at lower levels. So the reason I write my books of short stories is because that's what I want as a learner. I want interesting stories that are not too difficult and that have short chapters and lists of words to help me and things like that.
Okay, so you mentioned grammar briefly. Now, in one of your episodes, your advice to people learning a second language was don't learn grammar before you need it. Now, how can this work in classes that primarily work with either a syllabus or traditional course books, both generally using grammar as the basis of each unit? And I think also a lot of people, if they're learning another language, they will have learned in this kind of grammar vocabulary method.
Yes, there's a few different questions in there, right? It's like, why would I recommend something like that? And then what to do about it in a practical context, right? So in brief, the situation is that most language curricula are focused on grammar. They have a structural grammatical syllabus, and they focus on teaching. Their view of teaching the language is to work through the grammar of the language step by step. That's essentially how any textbook is organized. But we know that the vast majority of communication and meaning in a language is through vocabulary, not through grammar, which means by any objective view, it's the vocabulary that's more important than the grammar. And if you know words, for anyone who doubts this, if you only had words and no grammar, you'd be able to get your point across somehow, right? I go bar tomorrow, want beer, right? You just got words. And now if you have grammar but no vocabulary, what can you say? And obviously the answer is nothing. And so my starting point is that to teach a language through grammar is to get things the wrong way around. It's like building a house with the roof first. It doesn't make any sense. And so that's why I have that view. But the fact remains that language curricula and textbooks and so on are currently taught and arranged and organized through grammar. So what do you do about that? As a teacher, depending on the context you're in, you may have more or less control over your syllabus. If you work in a school setting with very particular specific end of term tests, there might not be much you can do about it.
Yeah.
If kids' grades are based on their understanding of different grammar structures, well, that's what you've got to teach, because otherwise you'd be deliberately failing them in their tests. And so the problem here basically just goes all the way up to government level, to Ministry of Education priorities. And there are some very progressive ministries of education in the world, and there are more and more differing viewpoints that can be seen in some school systems, but it's a very slow moving boat. And then so I think with in a freer context where you've got language teachers, maybe in a language school where they can kind of teach what they want, then I think the key is really just to kind of take the textbook as inspiration, but not stick to it too closely.
Yeah.
And so I would always tend to do things like the first thing I would do in a textbook is find the written texts and the audio texts and just use those as the basis for classwork. So get them reading, get them listening, and then try to encourage communication based on that material. And then you can kind of sneak grammar in other ways. If you're highlighting a particular phrase, for example, you can say, "Oh, by the way, did you notice what's going on with the verb here? Can you see?" And you just highlight it, and you raise awareness of the grammar, and maybe do a little bit of grammar instruction from time to time. But it's only in response to existing context. It's not the whole focus of the lesson.
I think a lot of teachers would be quite scared to take that approach because it's sort of really rigidly instilled in a lot of us, like grammar, vocabulary, this is how it's done kind of thing. And it gives teachers structure as well. Like
it does. And it's also an important point. It's also what students expect.
Yeah.
Students' expectations are one of the realities of the classroom that teachers have to deal with. If you, as a Japanese student learning English, have learnt English at school, then you've done nothing but grammar translation for 10 years.
Mm.
And so if you then go to take lessons with an English teacher as an adult, what do you expect? Well, you expect more of the same. And so if you're going to do some kind of crazy new input-based approach with students, you've actually got to re-educate them first before you can start doing that stuff. I remember I went through a period of teaching Dogme, or teaching unplugged as it's known. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's Scott Thorbury and Luke Medding's approach to teaching, which is basically emerging conversation. So textbooks out the window. Let's just create conversation here in the class and learn based on that. And it was fantastic, and students loved it. But it took time. I had to tell them all about what I was doing, and I had to kind of involve students in the methodology of the lesson, which is a very kind of novel thing in a traditional approach. But it can be incredibly effective if you can bring students on board and explain to them what you're doing, why you're doing it, and get them to buy into the process and even contribute to it. Then I think you can really get somewhere, because you're shifting students from this problematic mentality that most students have of, I'm the student, I'm paying you money, now you teach me. And it's like this idea of, okay, I'm going to open my brain and I want you to pour the language inside. It doesn't work like that. Student languages are learned, not taught.
Yeah.
So anything you can do to get students to just take some agency over their own learning is fantastic. And clearly that is much easier to do in an adult teaching context than in a school.
Yeah.
But if the question is how do you get the best results for your students, I think that's something that's fundamental.
Yeah. And I also would argue that you said like you'd have to re-educate your students into this mad new methodology. I've found that certain students of certain nationalities have to be re-educated even with the communicative context, because they've just never had their learning's been so passive. Yeah. They're just like, oh, deer in the headlights. I have to speak. What's going on? I don't like this. I've heard, I think we've all had a lot of those reactions from certain students.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got the question of, well, if you are, this can be very culture specific. So I remember teaching in Japan, and any teacher who's taught in Japan will know that getting students to kind of speak openly and freely and expressing their opinions on stuff is a difficult thing, because that's not how society works in Japan. And then I went from Japan to the Middle East, and I was thrown into the chaos of a Middle Eastern classroom where everyone's just like screaming their opinions left, right, and center. And the first thing that was just abundantly obvious right then was, well, hang on, like you can use the same methodology in two different contexts, and you can get two totally different results. So this is about teaching the class, teaching the students in the room, and not being too wed to any particular methodology. But this is where I think this for me only kind of highlights the drawbacks of being very dogmatic in a grammatical syllabus, because how can this work equally well for different people in different contexts? It really can't. So ultimately, it's about knowing your students and then being sufficiently skilled and experienced as a teacher to know where the intersection is between so-called good teaching and then what your students actually want and what's going to be best for them within that context. You can have the smartest, most engaged students in the world, but if they are not going to do any homework because they're too busy, then you've got to compromise. So it's all about compromise, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day.
I think it's going back to like learner autonomy or, students taking ownership. I think that's really difficult, especially younger students, so I think like I was listening to some of your pods and you were talking about, you've got all these tips how to learn a language, but I think self-discipline is the biggest one. I mean, even like last week, I decided I was going to brush up on my German. Used to be very good, terrible. So I started watching this really bad YouTube series that was a bit like Friends. And I got 3 episodes in and then I left it for about 4 days. Like I just, I didn't have the self-discipline to sit down for 25 minutes every day and do it. And I think I'm a relatively responsible grown up, So yeah.
Well, it just goes to show that knowing knowing the best thing to do is one thing, but actually doing it and following through is another. This is why I was on an interview just before talking with you, and we were talking about kids who get really into J-pop, J-drama, and then and K-pop and K-drama, so Korean and Japanese music and anime, things like that. And it's fairly common to find teenagers in the UK or the US or wherever who get really into this stuff, and they just spend 3 or 4 years of their life binging on Japanese cartoons or Korean dramas or something like that, and they're fluent in the language by the end of it, having just learned from their bedroom. It's not because they probably didn't even think for a second about their language learning method. They just spent so long immersed in the language that they just learned through just sheer exposure. So yeah, this is like
but I think also that goes back to compelling input as well. They were obviously really into it. The learning side became effortless. So yeah, that compelling input is absolutely essential, I think. And I think a lot of that's missing in a lot of the textbooks and a lot of the schools, and especially if they're using outdated books. I remember I'm not going to say what it was, but it had in the first unit like a bunch of sort of pop brothers and sisters. And I was teaching young adults, none of them had heard of any of them, and one of them actually said to me, "Teacher, why are we doing this? I don't know any of these people." And I'm like, do you know what? Huh? Yeah, do you know what? Let's just forget it. So we just skipped it and moved on. But I was less experienced then, but now.
Right. Well, exactly. So that's where the experience comes in, isn't it? Because there, as a more experienced teacher especially when you've taught a particular course book a bunch of times with different students in different countries, then you kind of know right away, okay, that's not going to work. Let's give this a wide berth.
Let's find something else.
So
finding out what your students are into right at the beginning, I think is absolutely essential. Final question. So you're very much a proponent of learning a language yourself and not necessarily using classes or tutors, but teachers listening to this might be thinking, hold on a minute. The points that you make for this argument are quite convincing, but I do think the majority of language learners do start in like a classroom environment or with a tutor. So what in your mind is a teacher's job?
What a question. The teacher's job is to motivate and guide the student to places where they wouldn't be able to get to by themselves. My rationale for saying that you don't need a teacher is not so much to say that teachers can't be useful or valuable or that you shouldn't get a teacher, but it's just to help people question the status quo, which is that for most beginners, they think, okay, I want to learn a language, therefore I go and get a teacher. Why should that be the case? What about other options? What about all the myriad options for learning by yourself? And the answer is usually, well, they just don't know how to go about it, and so it's just easier to find a teacher. It's what you're used to. It's what you expect. But the kind of core principle here is that you don't learn in the classroom. You learn by yourself. So there's never much learning that goes on in the classroom, even at the best of times. I mean, you might be able to perform some exercises, do some speaking activities, study some grammar, do some vocabulary activities. That is rather going through the motions, though. The place where input becomes intake, to use more Krashen language, is actually later when you go home and you're reading something, and you see, oh, that's that word I learned in class now. And then later on you go and speak to somebody, it's okay, what's that word I need to use? It's actually using the language by yourself. So any real progress in a language will happen during your own grappling and struggling with the language. And so for me, the real role of a teacher is to help facilitate that. So give students things to do by themselves outside class, motivate them to try new things, to get more input. And so personally, the way that I use tutors, because I use tutors when I learn languages, but what I do, I use them mostly for speaking practice and to get corrections and feedback on my speaking. I did a project a while back when I learned Italian, and I documented the whole thing on YouTube. It was a 3-month project, and I just documented everything I did, how I learned, what materials I used, etc., etc. And I followed this input-based approach. So for the first month, I did no speaking whatsoever. I studied no grammar. All I did was listening and reading for the first month, and then I started speaking after that first month. And I recorded my first whole week of conversations, and you can see all of those on YouTube. And the specific benefit of a teacher at that point was to have conversations with her and to figure out what I was getting wrong and to get feedback and corrections on that. So it's less a teacher, more a sympathetic listener. Okay. So someone who will indulge me in my kind of in my rudimentary Italian and help me improve it. And there's a huge amount of skill from the teacher that comes in on that as well, like knowing when to let me speak, knowing whether to spot correct, whether to offer a delayed correction or echoing what I'm doing. A lot of skill comes into that. And then from time to time say, look, Olly, you keep making this particular mistake. Why don't we just study that for a minute?
Okay. Yeah.
But that is quite different from a teacher saying, okay, class, today we're going to do this, tomorrow we're going to do that, and following a structured program. I think it's a fundamentally different dynamic. And
absolutely.
And it's not that anything is right or wrong, but it's just that for me, the main thing that I want to achieve is to encourage learners to have as much agency over their own learning as possible, because I think that's where the game is won.
Yeah. Does that sort of method, using your tutor as a guide, like you said, does that work with non-beginners as well? Like if I wanted to brush up on my German?
Oh yeah, 100%. Absolutely. For sure. And it's easier the higher you get, because you're able to receive more and more detailed and relevant corrections and more nuanced feedback.
Yeah. Excellent. Where can people find you on social media?
Yes, indeed. Well, podcast listeners, podcast fans can search for the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. You can visit my website, iwillteachyoualanguage.com. And I'm doing a lot of YouTube at the moment. So if you want to follow me on YouTube, I'm doing a lot of kind of fun, creative videos there where I talk about different ways of learning languages. So you can just go to YouTube and search for Olly Richards, and you'll find me there. And say hi if you do. Reach out, send me an email. That's what you did, right? And I replied. Did I not?
Absolutely, yes. And I was delighted, and I'm really happy that you took time out of your busy schedule, because I know you're busy, to talk to me. So thank you very much, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
It would be a pleasure. Thanks so much.